In the not-so-distant past, they say that visionary creators could make movies that felt fresh and original. Sometimes they caught lightning in a bottle and represented a generation in a way that had never been done before. And sometimes, just sometimes, that vision led us into a new era and left an eternal mark on pop culture history. This is the story of how The Crow changed the movie industry forever. When you think of movies in the late 90s and early 2000s, where does your mind go first? For me, it's undoubtedly the era of dark and edgy action movies. Gothic, brooding anti-heroes in tight, all-black costumes, standing on a rooftop and looking over the city streets with an alt-rock track playing in the background. It's a time in pop culture history that I've referred to before as 90s cool. And whenever that trend is brought up, the discussion always revolves around The Matrix. And it's easy to see why. The Matrix was extremely innovative, popular, and culturally important, and left a huge impact on the world. It undoubtedly represents the peak of that era, but in my mind, there's something about this narrative that needs to be amended. While The Matrix was undoubtedly the flagship movie of that time, there's another movie that deserves just as much credit for jump-starting 90s cool. And of course, I'm talking about Alex Proyas's 1994 Gothic masterpiece, The Crow. I think it's time we all recognize the cultural impact of The Crow. In the post-internet age, we've collectively become good at recognizing greatness. When you have millions of nerds analyzing every aspect of pop culture simultaneously, you're bound to find most of the diamonds in the rough. But even today, there are some things that still manage to fall through the cultural cracks. And this is where I feel The Crow is currently perched. It remains in a space where it's well regarded and beloved by its cult fan base, but isn't recognized nearly enough for the way it helped shape 90s and early 2000s culture. And I find this a little perplexing since the cultural impact of The Crow seems so obvious. For instance, one of the most famous wrestlers of the 90s, Sting, copied everything about his character from The Crow. There were so many movies and TV shows that popped up in the late 90s and early 2000s that were clearly inspired by The Crow. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we talk about how The Crow birthed a new era, it's important we understand why that was possible. Because as great as it was, The Crow was really a case of being in the right place at the right time. So let's take a brief look at the landscape of the early 90s. The early 90s was a time that was rife with potential for cultural change. Generation X were now rebellious teenagers and young adults, and they wanted things that represented their tastes and values. And as their generation cried out for change, suddenly, the sound of a raspy voice and a distorted guitar chord rang out from Seattle, and things were never the same. We all know the basic story. Nirvana blew up in 1991, introduced the world to the Seattle grunge sound and fashion, and effectively killed the 80s. And while there's some truth to that sentiment, the reality wasn't quite that simplistic. Grunge may have hit a critical blow, but the extremely powerful cultural identity of the 80s wasn't ready to die just yet. The fact that Steven Seagal was a major movie star until the mid-90s is a testament to that fact. Consequently, I see the early 90s as the battleground between the new generation taking over and the 80s hangover slowly fading away. Every industry had its own Nirvana-like watershed moment where we said, okay, the 90s has officially landed. The comic book industry had the release of Spawn in 1992. The video game industry was finding the 90s with the Genesis and was totally there by the time of the PS1. Mainstream wrestling was late to the party and took until 1996 to finally get with the times. So how does all of this relate to The Crow? Well, the film industry also had many of those definitive welcome to the 90s moments. And while it's difficult to say exactly when the 80s died in movies, it's quite apparent that by 1994, 90s cinema had arrived. There were so many statement films in 1994 like Pulp Fiction, Leon the Professional, Ace Ventura, and The Crow that felt like pure 90s being injected straight into your veins. In a year packed with seminal, decade-defining classics, what made The Crow stand out? By the time of the film's release, people were completely over the manufactured and fake image that the 1980s had degenerated into. We had rock stars who hated being rock stars, movie stars who hated being famous, and so forth. We were abound with self-awareness, nihilism, and youthful angst. And The Crow crashed through that cultural window with impeccable timing. It had everything that its young audience was craving. It was a low-budget movie that felt unapologetically raw, like an outsider of the corporate system. It had a lead character who was pure Gen X, a dark, brooding, gothic rocker who fit in perfectly with the counterculture spirit of the time. It was an adaptation of a renowned cult classic comic book series, which gave it credibility with hardcore fans. And to top it all off, its soundtrack was an instant classic, filled with great songs from alt-rock bands like Nine Inch Nails and Stone Temple Pilots. The Crow was one of the first movies that had its finger squarely on the pulse of Gen X alternative culture. And it wasn't in a fake or contrived way. It was made by people who clearly understood and loved the same material as its audience. It naturally and authentically resonated with its audience in the same way that the original grunge movement did. All of these factors, along with the curiosity generated by its tragic production, led The Crow to being the surprise sleeper hit of the summer. And movie studios took notice. If corporate sharks are good for anything, it's smelling the money. And so, in the coming years, 90s audiences looked to the sky and saw a number of brooding, trenchcoat-wearing heroes diving their way, and everyone was ready to fully embrace them. So now that we understand why The Crow took flight, let's talk about how The Crow spawned a new generation of action movies. Before we talk about how The Crow changed the movie industry, I want to take a step back and talk about what influenced The Crow itself, because the movie didn't just come out of nowhere. There were a number of important steps that led to it being possible. As fresh as The Crow was for the film industry, it was still very much a product of its time. More than anything, I think of The Crow as a puzzle piece movie. It took all of the trends that were hot at that moment from comic books, action films, and the music industry, and packaged it all together into something original. Being among the first movies to understand the cultural moment is easier said than done. For that to happen, you need hungry and visionary creators who truly understand the current cultural trends. For those of you who are over 30 like me, imagine how difficult it would be to make a movie that captures the spirit of Gen Z. I know I sure as hell couldn't do that. The stars had to align to make The Crow what it was. You needed creative minds like Alex Proyas and Brandon Lee who understood the moment. There are a ton of influences you could cite for The Crow's existence from pop culture, comic books, and films. But for the sake of brevity, I feel there are two main influences that need to be mentioned. The first and most obvious is the Crow comic book series that the film was adapting. The beloved cult series was written by James O'Barr as a reflection of his grief and regret in losing the love of his life to a drunk driver. Because of that, the comic book series was raw with emotion. It was dark, brutal, counterculture, and well in line with the underground culture that would explode in the early to mid-90s. It also went against the grain of the big, muscular heroes of the time and featured a hero with a more sleek and classical aesthetic. Although there were creative differences, the film adaptation did a good job staying true to the spirit of the comic book. The other major influence I'll talk about is Tim Burton's 1992 superhero film, Batman Returns. Tim Burton's dark, gothic, and stylistic depiction of Gotham City was the first step towards movies like The Crow. Without Burton's Batman being such a cultural phenomenon, there's no chance that The Crow film adaptation would even exist. Some people may feel that the 90s cool era started here. And while I think there's merit to that opinion, to me there's one key distinction between Batman Returns and The Crow. That difference is how each film integrated pop culture trends of the time. To me, Batman Returns was pure fantasy that was mostly detached from current cultural trends. The Crow, on the other hand, was the complete opposite and felt like a product of 90s counterculture. With all that said, now that we understand where The Crow came from, it's time we talk about how it led to a new era of dark, edgy action movies. In this section, I'll talk about the 5 main ways that I believe The Crow inspired many films in its wake. The Crow may have not been the first to do these things, but it was one of the first movies to package them together and deliver them to a wider audience. So let's get into it. Number 1. The New Age Anti-Hero. As I noted in my 80s cool retrospective, the 80s were all about the action hero. the macho, cocky, invincible, patriotic hero who wouldn't back down from anyone. It goes without saying that, by the mid-90s, this type of protagonist was totally out. The new generation was done with Top Gun American patriotism and super soldiers like Rambo. They wanted to root for someone who was less heroic and more flawed. Dark, moody, mysterious, tough, yet vulnerable, hiding their emotional turmoil behind a smile. A free spirit who rebelled against the man. All of this is to say, The Crow was the perfect anti-hero for the tastes of the 90s moviegoer. Brandon Lee's portrayal of Eric Draven was something special. He wasn't just dark and brooding, which was a common trope of comics at the time. He also had a fun and quirky side. There were so many choices that Lee made in his portrayal of Eric Draven that helped fuel this new archetype. The dark, manic bad boy who always wore a smile to hide his pain. But it wasn't just his attitude that made The Crow unique. It was also the visual flair that he brought to the table. First, you have his iconic look with that long leather trench coat, the combat boots, and so forth. But aside from the obvious, a lot of what made The Crow special was Brandon Lee's physical performance. Lee did so many exaggerated movements that were unnecessary and done purely for style points, but looked so cool. A perfect example of this is the way the Crow enters the Devil's Night meeting. When he got to the table, did he stand there or sit down like a normal person? Hell no, he didn't. Instead, he pushes over the chair and does this fluent jump into a badass cross-legged position. These sort of poses and exaggerated aesthetic movements inspired so much of the next decade of action characters. Number 2, the era of edginess. The Crow is likely the movie that led us into the crawling in my skin era of films. As an aside, writing that sentence made me realize why the film's cultural impact isn't taken that seriously. I think we tend to look back on that period as just a fun part of growing up, and not something as culturally important as it was. Either way, the dark and bleak nature of The Crow came from a mature and authentic place. But just like grunge led to the more commercialized post-grunge era, The Crow's success gave way to a more artificial, edgy era of movies and TV shows. Every character had to be dark, tortured, and mysterious because that's what was popular. From then on, all of our favorite characters fell on the chaotic side of the alignment chart. Good guys with a devil-may-care attitude and bad guys who just wanted to watch the world burn. It may sound like I'm putting this era down, but I'm not. I think that edginess isn't always a bad thing and has its place in entertainment. Most of us were young and edgy ourselves at one point, and those movies were exactly what we needed at that time. The Crow helped define the template for the influx of dark and brooding characters of that time. Number 3, 90s cool action. Going back to what I said about The Crow being a puzzle piece movie, nothing about its action was original or groundbreaking on a piece-by-piece basis. What was groundbreaking was how it packaged its influences together. It was clearly influenced by the gun-fu action of John Woo, the urban sword fighting of Highlander, and the high-flying martial arts of movies like Bloodsport. The Crow combined these three influences into the action style of the 90s. And while The Matrix took this style to the next level, it should be recognized that it all started with one scene in The Crow. A scene that I believe is one of the most important and influential action scenes of the 90s. The Devil's Night Shootout. This scene practically created the action style that many of us grew up with. So what made it so special? Mainly it's the way that Eric shifts between so many different styles that were usually segmented. The Crow's power set and invincibility made it so there were no limitations on what he could do, and so they went full-on comic book. One second the Crow's doing gun-fu, the next he's flipping around doing flashy martial arts moves, and then he's killing people with a katana. It may seem quaint compared to how far the gun and sword-based action was taken in things like the Devil May Cry series, but the DNA of this scene is felt all through the late 90s and early 2000s. Number 4, film grunge. When I say film grunge, it's not me calling The Crow a grunge movie, although that was an important part of its makeup. I'm using the term film grunge to explain the iconic look of its world. The Crow created this dark and grungy look that's also found in the opening scene of The Matrix, Max Payne, and Underworld, to name a couple of examples. It's a very recognizable and identifiable look, but it's difficult to put into words. But what the hell, I'll give it a shot. The world of The Crow takes a page out of the look of Manhattan in Escape from New York. Everything is run down, dark, dilapidated, dirty, and scummy looking. It's a hellhole filled with awful and despicable people. But its design is very 90s, taking a page out of the dark comic books of the time and Tim Burton's Gothic style. Everything is rainy and gloomy. All of the characters are wearing 90s alternative fashion with worn down and torn up clothing, and have that long, greasy hair and a heroin chic look. But here's the kicker. Despite everything looking worn down and ugly, many of the characters still have sex appeal. Brandon Lee was a really handsome guy, and the goth look fit him perfectly. The main villains are hot in a twisted sort of way. So I think that about sums up film grunge. A rundown, rainy, and grungy-looking world filled with hot and sexy people. Number 5, the soundtrack. Up until this point, I think it's clear that The Crow either created or greatly contributed to a number of cultural trends. But I saved the best for last. The Crow's soundtrack has to be one of the most influential film soundtracks of the 90s. It essentially compiled the sound that every dark action movie in its wake would try to recapture. The Crow's image may have been inspired by dark comic books of the time, but this style needed a sound to bring it to life, and The Crow gave us that sound. Its opening track, Burn by The Cure, hit you with those pulsating drums, a deep, moody bass line, and a melodic guitar line that created the perfect sound to accompany the film's dark and haunting world. And after that, there's one awesome track after another, from cutting-edge bands like Nine Inch Nails, Stone Temple Pilots, and Rage Against the Machine. Due to its incredible song choices and perfect timing, the soundtrack was a smash success, going 3 times platinum in America. It provided the roadmap that many other great soundtracks like the Spawn soundtrack and the Matrix soundtrack would follow. It also changed the kind of artists that producers approach to feature on film soundtracks. Sometimes these tracks became more popular than the film itself, like Bring Me to Life on the Daredevil soundtrack, launching the career of Evanescence. The only major ingredient of the quintessential 90s soundtrack The Crow was missing was that techno sound that was popularized a year later by Mortal Kombat. The reason I feel so passionately about The Crow's cultural impact is because the era it created was basically my childhood. So to highlight its contributions to pop culture, here are a number of important things that I feel either wouldn't exist or would look extremely different if not for the influence of The Crow. So here they are, the children of The Crow. The Crow has dozens of more children I could list off, but I think these examples help highlight the immense cultural impact that it had. And if you made it all the way here, I'm assuming you also have strong feelings on the topic like I do. So then the final question has to be, why was The Crow's cultural impact forgotten? I realize that in this case, the word forgotten is a little hyperbolic. Many people definitely remember The Crow, and it has a loyal fan base. What I'm really asking is, why isn't its pop culture impact more widely recognized? I think the reasons here are equally obvious and unfortunate. Just like a band with a great first album, a great film often needs an even better sequel to push its franchise into the stratosphere. And unfortunately for The Crow, this was impossible without Brandon Lee. The Crow sequels have their moments, but they weren't nearly good or impactful enough to keep up with the likes of Blade or The Matrix. The second reason is that it got overshadowed by The Matrix. The Matrix, quite frankly, took everything The Crow did and pushed it to the next level. It's a much more polished and sanitized movie for modern audiences to go back to. And while The Crow was a hit that helped greenlight movies like The Matrix was a once-in-a-lifetime, zeitgeist-defining blockbuster. Therefore, it's a much more marketable and memorable image to represent that era. With all that being said, I hope this video was fun for people who love The Crow and inspires more people to seek out the original so that it gets more of the credit that it deserves. Because when an era we love ends, the way we can help it live on is to always remember. Time may pass us by, and a culture may change, but a legacy lasts forever.